In these types of spaces, I just want to acknowledge our hosts, Ngāti Whātua, and also, of course, Jane and the team for a wonderful event. So we're going to try and mix things up by starting at a slightly different end, because one of the things that I think has come out in the last day and a bit is that we have to find our own language and space and place for debating these issues. We have to be clear of where we want to be. And so this is something, as the president of Te Hautukaranga Aotearoa, I have kind of battled with over the last 10 years, because universities, polytechnics and wānanga have been constructed as businesses for 2 decades now. And they're toxic places now because of that vision. They're toxic places for students, they're toxic places for staff. And actually they're not good for knowledge generation, and I think this is a real problem that we face. So we have spent, as many of the people in this room know because they're members of our union, we've spent 10 years now trying to really push the game into a completely different playing field, is I guess what I'm going to say. Not to amend their rules. There is no point amending the market's rules. The market is broken, fundamentally. Education is not a market. So we've tried to find a new playing field, and we've had the first indications in the last 6 months that we have a government prepared to call education a public good once again. We have members committed to doing that, staff and students committed to doing that. Sadly, as of yet, we haven't convinced the Vice-Chancellors or the chief executives of our institutions that they need to let go of their role as salespeople, managers and whips, and that they can actually treat knowledge not as a commodity, but as something that everyone should have access to. So that's just by way of kind of introducing why I'm keen to have this conversation. I'm going to ask each of the panellists to do the same, to let you know who they are and why they're so interested in knowledge, teaching, learning, sharing ideas, which is, of course, what the last 2 days has been all about.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Melanie Webber and I'm the Junior Vice President of PPTA, Te Wehingaroa, which is the post-primary teachers. So I'm high schools, essentially, and I'm a classroom teacher. I teach just down the road. I think we're just out of my zone at the moment, Western Springs College, Napunoa Waiarea. So I come to it from a slightly different perspective to these people who deal with it all the time. I deal with education in my classroom, and I deal with the impact that it has there. And when we look at how we are working to resist these things, it's about the ability of us as a collective to speak out against it. And that's where we're really fortunate in New Zealand with our really strong unions in education, which have enabled us to stand together. When the Employment Relations Act happened, we managed to maintain our collective agreement, which means that we are able to mobilise and organise teachers against these things, to stand up and to have a united voice, which has been hugely powerful for us in New Zealand education and resisting a lot of what's happened. Not everything, we don't win every battle, but we are able to get out there and speak about it. And so, for instance, last year, looking at the bulk funding of education, when we got together with NZEI and spoke against that. Similarly, for us, it's about standing up and saying this isn't okay. There's a teaching technique called the broken record. And the broken record is something you're taught to do, and that's when you just say something and you say it over and over again. And when someone comes back to you, you say it again. And for me, that would be that education is a public good. Education is a human right. And it's not a service, it shouldn't be monetised. Education is a human right and a public good, and that's what we need to stick to, because that is very hard to argue against. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou, ko tāne whā te kāinga, ko kianga te awa, ko nā tiki mā te whaurua te waka, ko nā te tautahi rawa, ko nā te rihia ngā hapu, ko teiringa rātou, ko taita me te oturei ngā marae, ko nā puhi rawa ko nā te whātua ngā iwi, ko Carrie Strada-Smith tōku ingoa. I guess I wanted to start with my whakapapa here, and I just want to mihi to George before, because I think everything, like he said, it begins with whakapapa, and mātauranga Māori and whakapapa for me are inseparable. because I think, like knowing things comes with responsibility, and that comes from your whakapapa. It's your responsibility to your ancestors, to your whānau, to your hapu, to current generations, but also to future generations. I guess just a little bit on why I'm quite passionate about mātauranga is it's not just it's a process as much as it's a practice. So it's the ways of being and engaging in the world. We use it to examine, analyse, understand the world. It helps us to understand different purposes and meanings, different ways of learning about our world that we can transmit from one person to another, from generation to generation. And it provides insight into different perspectives about knowledge and knowing. So I don't like to talk about just knowledge, but knowledge and knowing go together. And I think it's important for understanding the past, responding to current needs, and preparing future generations. So we need to know what we don't know, and always be aware about what we don't know that we don't know. And I think before, knowledge for me, I don't think should be seen as a commodity in the mātauranga sense anyhow. We should be talking about it as something that's shared. And that's how I like to look at trade, is it's actually about sharing. It's not about anything else except building friendships and sharing and then building relationships. And that goes back to the reciprocity element that was raised earlier on. But I think with knowledge, and particularly when it comes to cultural knowledge, we've got to kind of ask ourselves a lot of questions, and I don't think we've got the answers to those just yet, which is why I think it's really cool that we're having this conversation this afternoon. What are we willing to share? How are we willing to share it? Are there things that can't be shared? And how do we retain and exercise ownership of those things that we want out in the public domain, but we don't kind of want other people to own or decide how they're to be interpreted? So there's a lot of questions. I've probably got more questions than answers. But yeah, so that's my kind of passion around mātauranga and why I'm here today. Kia ora.
Kia ora tātou. I'm Alex Sims, and I'm from the University of Auckland, and I work in the monolithic building, the business school over there. And I was just thinking, as I was sitting here, my background is law, but I try to do everything but law. It's a bit of a joke. That's why I've moved in, because, law is useless. I'm sorry, but everyone says, well, we need more law, but no one, people breach the law and it's not enforced. So that's why I sort of moved on to blockchain, which I might mention later, because we can actually stop people from breaking the law in the first place. But actually, just with knowledge, one of my former areas of research and publication and teaching, well, I still have to teach it, is copyright law. And it just doesn't work. So it says it's meant to be incentives for people to create, but in fact, the best creations we've had recently are all open source. And, nothing works. And it's even with patents. So Guy Matchup in the 50s was commissioned to write a report for the US Congress and said if we knew now what we knew about patents, we never would have granted them in the first place. And in fact, the first patents in England were specially designed so people could go over to Europe and steal the inventions and bring them back. So it's got nothing to do with creativity. And in fact, intellectual property law actually stifles creativity because you can't do what you want to do. And then you get all the imbalance of power with people alleging you've infringed something when you actually haven't. One of the things was the internet was seen as being this way of decentralization and democratization and things like that. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened. In fact, it's almost been the reverse. Apple and Google and Facebook are actually more powerful than the former institutions that they were meant to break down. Far more powerful. They were just, Sears and Roebuck and all the American ones, they're actually quite limited. But the worry is that these new ones are, all around the world, and actually they employ a fraction of the people that they used to. But what is interesting with open source and now with blockchain is that what people want to do is totally change that. So there was a talk before about corporations being these alien beings. Well, actually people want to decentralize and have decentralized corporations, because at the moment you've got, say, Uber. So you've got Uber as the company, and you've got all these sort of serfs. You know, they're not even employees who are making the money, and Uber's walking off with it. If we can have a decentralized autonomous organization, that all it is a computer program linking people up, which is effectively what Uber is. You've got a reputation program. There's already people that are actually already worked on this. You can have it so that everybody that uses it can be an owner. And so it changes the distinction between the capital and the labour. And so it's a whole new paradigm. But the most interesting thing, and this is where I sort of have to use my law, is that how do you set the governance systems up? Because if you do not set them up, you'll end up almost worse than what we've got before. But very quickly, I just think that people just need, I'm sure it's not so much in this room, but just generally, people think that the current structure is the way it will be in the future. That's not going to happen. We are under incredible changes. Some people who can see it, I was at a thing the other day, and someone from Soul Machines, so a lot of you know about Soul Machines with computer, basically avatars that you talk to, which are already being used, and she said that she gets tingles down her spine when she realizes what's going to happen. And I get the same with blockchain. It's like, oh my God, we have no idea. So I think that we're on the cusp of radical change. And so I guess part of this is, what do we want? Because we can actually force change. This is not waiting for other people to come and tell us about it. People are already making a new world, but we need to make that new world how we want it and not let other people dictate it.
Kia ora, I'm sorry that you've got me as a somewhat imposter on the panel, because we had someone who was going to talk about culture and music and stuff, and then we had someone who was going to talk about media and journalism, and then they discovered it was Labour weekend, and so instead you've got me. And the reason why I'm especially interested to be on this panel is to pick up on in particular what Carrie and Alex said. Rather to my shock, I have spent the last 3 or 4 years working on understanding the digital elements of the international agreements. And one of the problems we have is that there was never a leak of these texts during the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement negotiations. And so whilst we had campaigns around the investment issues and the medicines issues and the democracy and secrecy and sovereignty and the Treaty of Waitangi, we never actually got people aware of what is the most dangerous development in recent agreements, which is the electronic commerce chapters. And so I want to talk a little bit in my contribution to the panel on this, because it is explicitly designed to firstly commodify and exclude people from using their own data and accessing systems by locking it up for the oligopolies of what Bernard Hickey was talking about yesterday, and to preempt the kind of options that Alex is talking about. And so what we actually saw, and it sounds like conspiracy, and it was conspiracy, that the big digital companies developed what they call the Digital 24 Principles, which they got the US Trade Representative to convert into legal text, and it is explicitly designed to lock in their dominance and control over the digital domain. And I will explain a little bit further about how that works, but we have very little knowledge already of what's happening. It's evolving so quickly. We've got drones and driverless trucks, we've got trading platforms, we've got blockchains, we've got digital currencies, and they're changing every year or 2 years in a fundamental sense, and they're transforming within that system every day. And states have no way of regulating, that they're doing desperate catch-up. And the whole objective that is now being achieved in these agreements is preempting regulation and locking in that control. And so it has massive consequences for the unseeable future for which we have no crystal ball. And hence when we're talking about knowledge and when we're talking, for example, about Māori data sovereignty and the control that Māori have over data, which is basic in terms of taonga and whakapapa, how do we deal with that in the debates we've had in the last day and a half in a world where all of that data, in fact, is locked up offshore by the big players?
I'm just going to try, if I can, to kind of summarise what I think that all of us have kind of said in our opening, and do correct me if I'm wrong. But one of the things that is clear from all of us is that we do need and we can have a role in determining the future. We just, that we can't just let it happen to us when it comes to knowledge, and that all of us know that we want to make sure that knowledge is something we share, something that comes through in all of our relationships, that it's about building relationships rather than selling widgets to someone. And that's quite a fundamentally different space to work from than where we currently are. But also, knowledge must be something that we all control in some way, the sharing of knowledge, but actually on our terms, which I think is what I was hearing, that, it's not about letting others determine whether the piece of knowledge we're sharing can be shared in a particular way and to particular people. So, I do like this concept of sharing knowledge, and I like the concept of the broken record, I really do, because it actually accords with what I heard when they Treasury first decided in New Zealand to turn education into a commodity that was saleable. What the Treasury Turks did, what the young officials did, is they walked over to the Ministry of Education and they'd go and they'd have morning tea once a week with the Ministry of Education officials, and I know this because the Secretary of Education told me this, and the neo-libs just kept saying, oh no, but education is just another commodity that we can sell. And they said it over and over for years, until the Ministry of Education officials were repeating it. And this is the broken record thing. So we want knowledge to be something that we share, and that we collectively control, and that we ask questions about who can share it and how they can share it, but that we actually build those relationships to have those conversations. So hopefully that summarises a little bit of the connection between all of us. Okay, so I'd like to kind of move on then to, and Jane's already started that conversation, so maybe Jane, we do start with you. Current free trade models, I think we'd all agree, don't work when it comes to knowledge, but is there something in particular that you all think we need to be looking for that's particularly broken? Because that might help us find solutions around the way we're currently seeing knowledge sharing, knowledge generation, and how do we? Alex has posed it. How do we deal with what's coming up rather than what's already been?
I think one of the things that is most broken is that we still talk about trade and trade agreements as if they are blocks of butter and slabs of lamb. And there is so little understanding of how incredibly sweeping these agreements are. And I unfortunately was teaching yesterday when Bernard Hickey was speaking, but I've seen some notes, and Bernard said when he was talking about the Facebook issues and the impacts on media and so on of what's happening, that there aren't actually many rules around services or around the digital, and that highlights to me the real problem, that people don't actually know what is in these agreements, and then challenge the willingness of our government to continue to sign up for them. So the RCEP negotiations that are happening this week, the e-commerce text, which was written by and for GAFA, Google, Amazon, Facebook and Apple, and it will benefit Alibaba, that is being, we call it organ harvesting. Right? That the same bits out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement are now being moved into agreement after agreement. So the RCEP being negotiated here now, the Pacific Alliance negotiations that are happening, the UK negotiations, the EU negotiations, and they're trying to push it in the WTO as a new plurilateral agreement. That will lock up those that digital space and the ability for us to regulate and to lock open the commons, or to deal with te tiriti issues in the future. And so we need very rapidly to build an understanding of what is happening with that, and to build a constituency, from, for example, consumers. If you've got rules that are saying you can't require data to be held inside a country, if you've got rules that say you can't require disclosure of the source codes and algorithms that drive those search engines, if you can't require an offshore supplier to have a presence in your country, then even if we regulate, we can't actually access the data and the source codes and and have any access to those players to hold them to account. And so what happens to competition law and what happens to consumer protections and human rights law and whatever treaty protections we might put in place and whatever notions that we have of public education that are dependent on those offshore suppliers of commodified library resources or digital courses and so on. And so I think we've got to build our understanding of what the heck is going down there and put the reins on what is happening, because the discussions I had with MFAT officials on this, when I said to them, why are you promoting this? They said, because our companies have problems in China with China wanting access to our data. So there is no conception of what the global rulemaking process on this actually will mean for us. And there is no accountability for that.
I just want to say, it may be, maybe I'm naive and over-optimistic, but this is one of the things that blockchain can actually solve. So at the moment we've got this thing that, yes, we have the so-called right to privacy, but other people have their information. So when you sign up to something, you've got to give all your information over. Well, with blockchain, what you do is you hold the information and you grant other people access to it. So it fundamentally shifts it. So it's no longer their information, it's your information. And if you don't like it, you just walk, say, for example, you could have a equivalent of Facebook on a blockchain, and if people don't like it, they can, what we call fork that and create a whole new one with different rules, with all the same information, or you can just take it away. And so it fundamentally changes everything. Okay? Sorry, sometimes I talk to people go, oh, my brain hurts. Your brain should hurt because it is totally different. And the other thing with also is that, yes, we're talking about trade, so goods coming in and out. Well, 3D printers, how many years is that? So we won't, a lot of the stuff you won't actually need. And then another thing is the so-called sharing economy hasn't really been sharing because it's been people like Uber and other people making money in Airbnb, but we will be able to use resources a lot better. And with the 3D printers, you'll be able to break it down and recycle. So I'm not sure when it is, but maybe it's this utopia, but things are different, okay? The old rules, the old physical rules don't matter anymore, but it's a fundamental paradigm shift.
Well, obviously, there's a whole lot broken in our trade system. And I just want to build on that kind of sharing economy stuff. I think we've got all our young people, they're coming through, and I think if we can get them to shift kind of their thinking, that's where we're going to start actually seeing the benefits of what a sharing economy is. I think for me, one of the things that I've been kind of thinking about lately is, what is the purpose of trade? Why do we do it? And for me, it's about, for me, it's peace. We do it for an enduring peace, and trade is a mechanism for that, provided the tikanga's right when you are looking at the trade. So there's a practice which is kind of unchanging. It's importing, it's exporting, it's exchanging ideas, it's all that stuff. But the value system on which it's built needs to change. And so what we're hearing at the moment a lot from MFAD and NZTE is, oh, hey, look, we're moving from this volume to value-based economy. And, you know, when I first heard that kind of comment, I was like, oh yeah, that sounds kind of cool, because I'd interpreted what they'd meant by value. They didn't mean values. They meant, oh look, we're just going to send, make all these really premium products, send them off to the middle class, and we're not going to change how all the profits are redistributed back to our communities. So that's the thing where I'd like to see, if we could look at markets differently. So I like to look at markets as freed markets, freed from failed ideologies, freed from kind of false histories, freed for shaping a sharing economy, and freed for future generations. So part of that, what does that look like? It's growth agnostic. It's drawing on Kate Raworth's donut economics is something that I found kind of quite compelling, where we do have that socially just foundation, and we recognise that we've got this kind of ecological ceiling, and within it we are doing things that are regenerative, and we are redistributing profits. So profits for me aren't bad. I think the question is, I'm critical of how are they obtained and then how are they redistributed. Because if they're obtained in an ethical way, we need to be engaged in commercial activity, especially when I look at our Māori communities. If we're going to lift our standard of living, there's nothing inherently wrong with commercial activity, because that's what's going to free us from the state. And that's what ultimately we want to be able to act on our own accord, and exercise our own sovereignty. So, for me, it's peace over profits is something that we kind of have to start doing, and that's about the reciprocity. You've got to be building those really strong relationships with our kind of trading partners and start looking at them as friends, not as, oh, you're just this thing that I have to transact with to get this particular benefit. It's got to be bigger than that. And once you reach that, then we can start looking at, well, how, when we're dealing with our mātauranga, that's when we can start having that mutual understanding and creating kind of respect around things that are taonga and things that are tapu, and things that they'll start listening, and we can start kind of understanding what we can share and what we can't share. Because I just think that it needs to be kind of, when you're doing, or a new trade needs to be mana enhancing. It can't be about, we're going to extract as much as we can and go back into that kind of commercial negotiation kind of framework where no one tells anyone anything. You're going to have a better agreement if everyone's on the same page about the mutual benefits you're all going to get. And so I think one of the things I've been thinking about lately is what is the enabler to getting there? Because we can talk about it and it can be all conceptual and ideological, but what are we going to put down as a solution to some of that? And for me, it's something around looking at Indigenous to Indigenous trade enablers. And it's something that I think New Zealand's kind of leading on in a way, because we do have the Chapter 19 in the ANZTEC agreement, and that allows for Māori to have a direct relationship with the Indigenous peoples in Taiwan. And I think that's a really cool kind of starting point. I wouldn't say it's a bit soft. It doesn't allow for, as much sovereignty as we'd like. But I think it's a good starting point there. And I know that I recently was at the World Indigenous Business Forum, where Dr. Jim Collard was talking around kind of Indigenous trading in North America. And so they're looking as well. They have tried to introduce an Indigenous chapter into the NAFTA agreement, but it was kind of kicked to the curb. So it's somewhere where I think if we can start having kind of those conversations, because that way the government can start taking accountability for the findings in Y262. So, we do start having that protection for intellectual property, for intellectual cultural property as well, for Māori plants and things. We might be able to incorporate UNDRIP into it, and then look at how we strengthen the treaty clause, like the Waitangi Tribunal said, something that's agreeable to both Māori and the Crown. So yeah, I think there needs to be more work done around that space, and I actually think the government has an opportunity to also look at the WTO and go, well, hang on a minute, you've got this enabling clause under the Marrakesh Agreement. Now, how it only says developed countries, so we invisibilise entire Indigenous nations in the WTO because we don't have anything specific for them. So one of the things I've been thinking about is around how do you move kind of that developing countries kind of kōrero to developing economies, and then it might be able to give special exemptions for Indigenous economies, because at the moment they're wrapped up in the national economy, yet we know that they're developing in status because, you know, we've had colonisation that we've had to come through. We haven't had the same starting point. So I think there's lots of work that can be done around advocacy and influencing some of the kind of the international rules, but New Zealand taking a lead. And if we're really serious about having a progressive and inclusive trade agenda, then we kind of have to, I think, like you said, we have to be willing to accept that we need radical change, not just kind of talking on the margins. So, kia ora.
Kia ora. Yeah, the stuff I'm thinking about, the stuff is really important, but I'm also thinking about the way in which these agreements seek to make it okay for corporations to make profit out of providing education. So it's thinking about that global education market and that idea that education's worth 6 to 8 billion and that we need to be, trillion, and we're trying to make profit out of it. It's the 4.5 billion that international students bring into New Zealand. And this is an area that really worries me. We see increasing numbers of international students in our schools. And these sorts of agreements seek to, protect the right of us to sell our education, and that's what a lot of it goes in behind. But what I don't see happening always is the question, is this the best thing? Is the best thing for the students? Is it the best thing for the schools they're coming into? And I see students being treated in a way like cattle, like something to be sold that you're trying to get. Under this guise of globalisation and this being a good thing. And these are the questions I don't think we ask enough, what this means for the kids here on the ground. And so we hear people saying that, it's a global society and we must bring people across, but really we're bringing them in for purposes of money. We're using it to subsidise the underfunding of our public education system. And we're treating them as cash cows, and it's not okay. I mean, that's what's happening here in New Zealand. We're protecting our right to do that. On an international level, I worry about the increased privatisation, so that in the US, it's gone, for-profit universities were 0.2% in the 70s, and they've gone to sort of 9.1% in 2009. Well, then that goes global as well. And so organisations like Bridge Academies, those low-cost private schools that are moving into those markets and taking away the rights of people to develop their own curriculums, to value local knowledge. You've got this very standardised education coming in that's about skills and that is, and competencies. You've got what these students are actually learning is being measured by these same companies. It's hugely, hugely problematic. And these are the things that worry me, what is happening in our schools. So for instance, Bridge Academies initially, they started out building their own schools. But this cut into the profitability of it. So they started going to governments and saying, hey, we can provide the education that goes on in your buildings, let us do that. And it's very tempting for governments to abdicate that responsibility to the private market. And the problem with these trade agreements is that because they protect the rights of these corporations above the human right to a free public education, is that once you have allowed these institutions into your country, or these businesses, let's not say institutions, once you've allowed these businesses into education in your country, it is very hard to get them out. And you are going to have to pay to get them out. And this is why we need to be really aware of what's happening, particularly in terms of assessment systems, which is increasingly globalised, and making sure that we do not let them in. Because once we have allowed them in, which may seem like a public good, or may seem like it's easier or simpler, once they're in, it's very, very hard to get them out.
Sandra, can I just make a very quick pick-up on that? And this is, it's a huge trap that isn't really very explicit in the trade discussion. When, for example, you hear people talk about the number of jobs in New Zealand that are dependent on trade, that includes the education sector as a whole and the tourism sector as a whole. Right? So it is both a deception, It's a commodification, but it also shows how deeply embedded the notion of export education has become. And not only the disincentives to move from that, because it's become such a systemic part of funding and of New Zealand's foreign exchange earnings, but when we're in negotiations internationally, New Zealand and Australia are the major demandeurs of other countries to make commitments on trade in education services. So we are the ones who are pushing other countries to have to make these commitments. And that in turn means if we're asking them to do that, then we're not going to be retreating from that ourselves. And so it's a very pernicious position that we've taken for many years, and it needs to stop.
Absolutely, thank you, Jane. Because this in of itself is a teaching and learning space, I'm going to give you about 4 or 5 minutes just to have a quick chat to the people next to you, because just listening to people talk is actually not a good activity when it comes to teaching and learning. I do know that. Something about being a university lecturer taught me that. But I do want to just comment, if you don't think it's real, the trade in education in New Zealand, yesterday I quoted on or I retweeted something, as I'm often want to do, from one of the major for-profit companies in New Zealand who sells tertiary education. They were looking for an admissions officer, someone to admit students, and the line said, if you want to come and help get students admitted into our thing, apply for our sales and marketing job. Sales and marketing, that's all it's seen as. It's not seen as about finding the right place for students to study. It's not seen as about finding the right students to come into our spaces to collectively work together to generate knowledge. You are selling a commodity, full stop. So about four or so minutes, just to chat to the people around you. For people who are online, sorry, you're going to have to chat to yourselves, unless you're sitting around a computer with somebody else, but do add in some online comments. But also if there are technical clarifications or questions about what's been said so far, please share those with the panel, and we'll get to them and we'll answer those. Then we're going to go on to the where to from here. So your first one is, have you got any clarifications you need? Stretch, talk to the person next to you. I will bring you back in 4 minutes. And don't forget to write down any queries you have. how we answer. I mean, to me, a lot of this. I mean, it's just. It's corporate branding. You've got about a minute more.
Okay.
1 minute. Okay, I'm going to call you back together. I'm just going to see if there's any group that's got something that's really burning that they want to share. A really burning comment or question that you have to share before we go to some technical questions. No? Some groups are still chatting. They'll get my idea in a moment. Anything burning, really burning on knowledge and education and knowing and sharing information that you want to chat about very quickly? Okay, we're back in. Everyone's going to do the right thing by you. Please say who you are to everyone as well.
Kia ora koutou, ko ati Joyce Tukuinwa. I want to just say something about sharing knowledge, because our education system is rampant in sharing knowledge, and it's perpetuated what we've already got. So in our textbooks and all of that, and it hasn't validated or acknowledged mātauranga Māori. So when we talk about partnership, we can't even sort that out ourselves between two treaty partners, because we're talking about relationships. Well, they're functional. You need something from us, we need something from you. It's not genuine, so we're still perpetuating what we have in these systems and structures. It's still Western knowledge. And anyway, and that it should come from the whenua. And when we talk about the systems and structures, we still work in the same systems and structures, and they've been socially constructed, so how do we socially deconstruct them? So we're working with different systems and structures that actually promote genuine power sharing.
Yep. Great. I couldn't agree more. From a university perspective and from all the rules that guide what we do, mātauranga Māori knowledge is absolutely seen as not knowledge, actually, I'd say in the first place, which I think is important. Okay, cool. Quick comment?
Kia ora. I just want to invoke ngā kete o te wānanga, the three baskets of knowledge. That Tāne ascended to the highest heaven and was given by Io Matua Kore, the Almighty. And there's the three baskets, Te Kete Tuauri, Te Kete Tuatea, Te Kete Aronui, and brought those back to earth for people. The particular thing that I see about that is, this is my own reading of it, it's all there in the baskets. And it was given to us, by the Almighty. And all you have to do is just take it out of the basket. That's all we're asked to do as people. We've been given the three baskets. Just take it out of the basket. It's all right there. And for me, that's a very different starting point from the commodification of knowledge that we have nowadays. It's actually been given to us inside baskets, brought back to where we are, it's all there. All we have to do is just take it out of the baskets. And yeah.
Any other burning kind of clarifications or questions or comments?
What is blockchain?
Well, okay.
Technical question.
I'll tell you what, no, the quickest thing to do is go, so my name's Alex Sims, just Google Alex Sims blockchain and have a look at my profile page, because I put stuff especially for people like you and other people that want to learn more. No, because it's like this, it's like this whole parallel universe, and once you get in you go, oh my God, I never knew that existed, this is just insane. That's what I would do.
So it's a way of holding information, but a different way of holding information.
It does so much more. Sorry, don't get me started, okay? Basically, all my life now is talking about blockchain to people.
We have a couple of questions that are written down. Keep writing them down. But I'm going to also ask you to write something else, which I'm going to ask the panel to answer at the moment. If you could do one thing now to shift the way knowledge is shared, knowing is shared, information is held. So dealing with this question, what would you do? What one thing? The reason being that we can't do it all, but where's your starting point? But I'm going to get Jane and Alex to speak to some comments that were received. So Alex, do you want to kick off?
Just very quickly, what would it take to make personal data and blockchains a reputable way of responding to demands from service providers for data? Now, with everything, it's not the technology per se, it's attitude. So you can have the best technology in the world, but no one adopts it. So at the moment, people there's that saying that data is the new gold, or is the most valuable thing in the world. And so people don't want to give it up. And so what can happen is, say, I've got all my information on my what we call hashed to my phone. And so, for example, if I go in somewhere and they won't ID me because I look too not under 20, but for someone that's younger, at the moment, if you want to prove your age, you've got to give your driver's license or your passport that says your name, your date of birth, your gender, and things like that. And so all they have to do, and this is actually being used around the world, is just ask, are you over 18 or not? And then it will say yes, and that's fine. So they need to trust the system, but it's there if they want to use it. So it's possible. So they've just got to accept for not having that information. Saying like verified address and things like that. Yes, this person has got a verified address. You don't need to know the address, okay? So that's fine. The second question, blockchain, okay. If you give one person access to information, can they pass it on? Because basically it's giving equivalent of a key to someone to unlock some information. Well, no, they can't. Well, if you badly design, they could pass it on, but what you can do is just grant access to one person, and that's why we need digital identity. And this is a sort of a scary thing in the blockchain world, because you can actually identify people if you want. But you just don't need that. You can just have it for a short period of time, and it expires, so even if they gave it to someone else, no one could access it. So you can do whatever you want, and that's a great thing.
Tax evasion and how these mechanisms in relation to data facilitate the likes of Microsoft and Uber and others on tax evasion. There is a big international program underway to deal with what's called base erosion and profit shifting, which is the more recent version of multinational companies organising themselves internationally to pay tax in the places where there is least tax liability. One of the big problems we've got with the new e-commerce chapters is we're seeing tax havens and data havens happening in the same place. So if we cannot require the data to be held inside our country, if we cannot require the company to have a presence inside our country, and they can hold the data anywhere in the world they want, which is also a tax haven, if they can structure their company as Uber does, I've got a wonderful diagram of how Uber does this, then they don't pay tax. Now, the more we have stuff being done digitally, and especially from outside the country, the more the impact on the revenue base of our country
is eroded, at the same time as the increase in precarious jobs and the loss of business because our small businesses are not going to be able to access Amazon's first page and so on. We're going to have more demands on revenue at the same time as we're going to have a dwindling of the tax base. And if we cannot access, because of the rules in these chapters, the data, and we cannot force them to have a presence inside the country, we are going to have really, really serious problems. And I've been working with some other people internationally on that. The second part of this question, which kind of wasn't linked that much, was about charter schools and FTAs. And Melanie's already addressed that to some extent, but I want to be a little less optimistic than Carrie about the options in relation to mātauranga Māori. One of the arguments we've had for a very long time, and Animi Kaire raised this a bit yesterday with Tuananga o Raukawa, is that calling kaupapa Māori schools charter schools rather than actually treaty-based education processes buys into the privatised and commodified model rather than developing what George was talking about a model that's actually based on a kaupapa Māori approach to education. And that I think is a dilemma because unless we can think differently about kaupapa Māori education, it's difficult to break out of the model that's framed there now and to say Māori ones are different from the private for-profit ones.
Just very quickly, practical things. So, for example, don't advertise on Facebook. The New Zealand government, it's the biggest advertiser, it pays Facebook. Also, don't use Facebook or Google. Just don't use them. I mean, people use them and then they go, oh, they're evil. I mean, yeah. Sorry, it's just like that's, weird.
So just because I am going to practice what is a very Western philosophical tradition and stand at a lectern so that I can keep things in control, no. I just thought I'd use the extra mic, really. We have exactly 6 minutes, panel, to give one solution each. I know Alex has just given hers, but given that we're doing broken record, you might want to do it again. One thing you would do right now where we can make sure that we are sharing knowledge and data on our terms and that we're thinking outside the current paradigm and we're making sure that we don't lose our power and sovereignty. So one thing in this space, I know it's hard, but we'll start with Donna, shall we? Are you ready to go? Who's ready to go?
I'll say quickly, learn about blockchain.
I just want to say that Māori actually share knowledge as part of who we are, so we're already sharing our knowledge. What I think we need is not necessarily to demand that the state validate it. We don't need the state to tell us whether our knowledge is valid or not. What we need is our communities we engage with to actually listen to us, so that when we've got an opinion or something, no matter what the sector is, listen to us, because our mātauranga is valid already, and we're trying to give you an insight into where all this other Western knowledge is going wrong, so we can look at things like climate change and go, hey, look, polycultural farming, we've got these methods on how you can, have these carbon sequestering arrangements that you don't need pesticides and insecticides for. So I'd say listen to us, we actually do have some answers to some of those big questions.
Oh, Melanie?
I'm going to go big in Pollyanna and say ban all for-profit companies from education. It's, education is a public good. It's not a service and it shouldn't be commodified. And I find it really interesting the role that we play elsewhere in it in terms of affecting it. There was a question here around the education system and how it's entrenched the Western knowledge, power, and continues to marginalise the Mātauranga of Tangata Whenua. Well, that's something that we are doing internationally and globally and allowing to happen with these for-profit companies. And I'm just going to really quickly, I know I mentioned Bridge Academies before, but they are so evil. And they have a curriculum so they're operating in, say, Kenya, Ghana. Uganda has thrown them out. But they have a curriculum that is developed in the US. It's delivered by secondary graduates using iPads and scripted lessons. And so how do you validate the local knowledge in those countries? And the standardisation of education erodes our ability to critique, systems. It damages our competence to deal with really complex global problems. And this is what Carrie's talking about. It is hugely, hugely problematic, and we simply cannot trust for-profit companies in education.
My one is join the working group on the digital issues that I am hoping is going to come out from this hui, so that we can put pressure on the government to take a position of no new commitments in relation to commodified data and knowledge in any future agreements similar to the position they've taken on ISDS, and start to work on how we exit, through some ways we might talk about later this afternoon, from the commitments that they've already made, of which there is only one binding one so far, which is the TPPA.
Fabulous. Because they're such a good panel, they've given you 3 minutes. They've gifted you 3 minutes. Has someone got an idea they want to share that they think should be first up in this knowledge space? Because this is a collective brain, not just 5 in front.
Alex, in this brave new world where the internet sort of provided everything as blockchain, open source and all the rest of it, and I agree, it's shifting rapidly, are trade agreements relevant at all? Are we just wasting our time talking about them? Is it all going to be overtaken in a different world?
Well, it may be, it may not be, but there's a transition period. So in the meantime, a lot of damage can be done. So you can't just say it will happen. I mean, the internet, everyone thought that it would be a lot different than what it has been. So if, Brave New World, I actually reread it to my son a year or so ago, and it's actually quite scary. So I don't think we really want that Brave New World.
Kia ora. I want to step away a little bit from the digital and the for-profit knowledge and go back to look at our institutions such as schools and make a comparison between the new early childhood centres that pop up everywhere for profit. One of the things that I see is very serious about our institutions is the land, because as we see with Unitech, here we are, $50 million being sold off. The schools are seen as great areas of land. And what is that land about? Why was it put there? It was put there for the well-being of the children's learning or the students' learning and for the future. So it's some of the past, some of it was gifted Māori land, and it is also looking at the future as we see the schools in areas like Auckland where children go out, or students go out, and like Mount Albert Grammar I hear, and they pick up their phones and they're again tied into this data propaganda because they have nowhere to go and play, whatever age people might be, and it's also seen as a huge profit. And I understand other institutions are doing the same as Unitech.
Yeah, bringing it back to place and space is really important. One last one then, Valerie, you want to? It's the virtual people.
I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things around the blockchain and the control of information, and kind of pose a question. So coming from the union world and the union background, it was our labour, right, that we collectivized and we joined together, that we brought in order to exercise some power. Now we talk about our data as the thing that we have that is the valuable thing. How do we recognize and I suppose realize the collective power of the ownership of that data? What are the possibilities? Is the model of unionism, does it have some relevance for that? And I guess what's the possibilities for the blockchain in terms of that collective action and collective power, within Aotearoa and globally?
I think this is, James just said it might be talked about later, but just very quickly, we don't own our data at the moment. So other people, all we've got a right in New Zealand is to, for example, you can a right to access it as long as it sort of doesn't conflict with anything else. You've got no right to it at all. So with the blockchain is that if you want to do something create your own systems, then you'll own the data. So it's a thing of sort of weaning off, things like Uber and things like that, and then going on to a different system. So it's creating...
There is some collective space.
Yes, there is collective space. Yes, and people are already doing it.
Fabulous. Look, I want you to join me.
Sorry, can I just... There are 3 reports on union issues in this context that are also accessible.
Yep.
Sorry. That are also accessible. There's one for the International Transport Workers Federation, one for Uni Global, and one for the International Union of Food Workers, which is looking at some of those questions and how they might organise in response to those challenges. So they're all on those unions' websites.
If you could thank the fabulous panel for raising some amazing issues, leaving with some more questions and answers, but I actually agree with Kerry, that's actually really important. This is about asking the right questions at the right time and being ready to hear those questions and hear those challenges as well. So thank you for being very willing to hear the challenges put by the panel, and please thank them for their stellar work here and in all spaces where they go. And if you've got bits of paper,